Hi, welcome everyone. We are very happy to have again with us Mr. Andrew Yamato from the Greek Phalanx Living History Organization. He was here last year, and this year he has more surprises and a few more interesting things, weapons, armor that he's going to show us. The Greek Phalanx is a reenactment organization that solely it does this historical reenactment for hoplites. Those are men at arms from the archaic and classical periods, from 750 BC to approximately 323 BC. So the warriors you see in the movies of ancient Sparta, classical Athens, they had men at arms, hoplites that used to fight the wars. And it's going to explain to you their daily life, what they ate, how they dressed, and what armor they wore to go to battle. All right? So he was also with us with another gentleman when we had the musical, the rock musical, the visiting story of Mrs. Amber Florienta. They were part of the show for St. Demetrius, April 22nd, and they were here also last fall. So I'd like to introduce to you Mr. Andrew Yamato, and the website is thegreekphalanx.org. All right? Thank you very much.
Good to be back. Thank you for having me. Efkaristo. I am not Greek, so my pronunciation is going to be pretty bad somewhere, so you guys all feel free to correct me. But first, can I get a show of hands? Who was here last year? Okay, so, all right, good. So, most of you. I'm obviously going to repeat a lot of what I talked about last year, but I'm going to introduce some new things as well. But especially for those of you who weren't here last year, I just wanted to sort of explain a little bit about what I do, about who I am and what I do as a historical reenactor. Now, can anyone give me a definition of what they think that hobby is? Anyone? Wow, throw me a bone. Okay, a reenactor is someone who understands history and interacts with history by literally inhabiting the clothing and equipment. It tends to be done for military history, but not exclusively. You know, anytime you go to a historic village or something and they've got people churning butter or weaving cloth or something, those are reenactors. They're interpreting the past by wearing the clothes and sometimes actually even adopting the personas of the people that they're depicting in history. Now, I've been a military reenactor for about 25 years now. I've done all sorts of eras, World War II, World War I, the American Revolution, ancient Rome, and then I finally ended up with being able to do what my passion since childhood was, which is ancient Greek history. Now, I'm going to kind of go a bit more into what I mean by ancient Greek history, because there are lots of, we're talking about a 1,000-year period, really more than that. So we'll get a little bit more specific. But my group that I founded about a couple of years ago is called the Greek Phalanx. And what we mainly do is wear the uniform and equipment of Greek hoplites, encamp in an authentic encampment at events where people can come and see us and interact with us. These tend to be timeline events, where they have different eras represented kind of in a parade of history. And we have to do that because there aren't many of us. There aren't many Greek reenactors in the whole world, really. If you want to do American Civil War, there are tens of thousands, almost any weekend or gathering someplace. But for Greek, it's a pretty small community. It's a pretty narrow interest. But I gotta say, I'm really glad to be living in New York City because for two big reasons. One is that we have the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which is one of the best collections of Greek artifacts anywhere in the world. Have you guys been into the Met Museum to look at the Greek and Roman galleries? They're amazing. I mean, it's such an amazing thing to have access to those. I go several times a year and spend hours just looking at pieces of armor and then making them eventually. The other reason is that New York City has a big Greek American community. There are not many places where I could speak to a crowd of high school students who are immersed in Greek history and culture. And so it's a real privilege, and thank you very much for having me. Like I said, I'm not Greek, but I have a great love for the culture, and I really welcome any questions and input you might have. in general, like, I will definitely have some a question and answer period at the end, but if you have questions as I'm going along, just kind of wait till I finish the sentence and go ahead and put your hand up, and we'll try and deal with the questions you have as they go. All right? So, without further ado, I am coming out today in the pretty universal attire for a Greek man. And these are leather sandals. They have hobnails on the bottom that give you a little traction. These are basically iron nails that you just pound in there. The chiton is the universal garment. For women, it would be longer, and for older men, it would be longer. But young men and men in their prime would have worn them a little bit shorter, sometimes quite short. And then over that, we have the chlamys, which is a heavy woolen tunic. The chiton would have been made out of a light wool, or maybe linen, or maybe, probably both. And the cloak was definitely a woolen thing. And I'm dressed right now as a typical Greek traveler might be. I'd probably have an additional bag, a satchel, and maybe something to carry my water in. We'll get back to that in a minute. But the main purpose of this cloak, aside from being a bit of an outer garment, is it's your bedroll. It's what you'd sleep in at night. It's what you'd wrap yourself up in. So you're pretty self-contained. You hit the road in ancient Greece wearing this. And of course, the sun hat is an essential element because it's just stinking hot in Greece all the time without them burning to a crisp in no time. As I found out last summer, when I was in Greece, actually, with about 100 reenactors from around the world commemorating the Battle of Plataea. And we spent a week camping on the battlefield, reenacting elements of the battle, doing experimentations to sort of figure out how all this stuff worked. And that's something that I really want to come back to throughout the course of the presentation today, is telling you about the sort of interesting and unique role that we as reenactors have with ancient Greek that doesn't really pertain to some more modern eras. Like if you're a reenactor of World War II or something, which I have been for many different armies, everything that there is to know about those guys, those soldiers, those armies has already been told. It's written in some book, probably dozens of different books. It's just a very well documented era. It's just a kind of a matter of doing your research to kind of know everything there is to know. The reenactor role is still very important because they're presenting it to the public, they're getting them interested in it. But they themselves are not contributing much to the historical record. Now that's very different from ancient Greek because the historical record is so patchy. It's based on texts. We have a number of written texts, usually on pottery, sometimes on pottery, that has given us the great plays and just histories like Herodotus and Thucydides. Artwork, primarily pots. You guys know those Greek pots. There's just thousands of them throughout the whole world, and they're all incised with beautifully detailed line drawings of exactly what that world looked like. It doesn't tell you necessarily what the stuff was made of, but it tells you what it looked like. And then archaeological finds, stuff that people actually dig up in the dirt. And we kind of combine all those bodies of knowledge, which are all very incomplete, all very literally fragmentary, and try and synthesize a notion of what this stuff actually was. There's a lot of debate, there's a lot of controversy. But what's interesting is that even the experts, even the professors, even the authors are paying attention to what we as reenactors are doing because no one's ever made this stuff. No one's ever worn it. No one's ever tried to fight in it. And so they're very interested in the conclusions that we reach. So that's just a little shout out to the hobby more generally and what we do as Greek reenactors. So getting back to ancient Greece. You guys are familiar with like the Trojan War, right? Obviously, everyone's heard of that, probably seen the movie. The Trojan War is what we call the heroic age, or the Bronze Age. And that is 500 or 600 years earlier than what I'm going to talk to you about today. The heroic age, like they're talking about, you read Greek mythology, right? You know, like Hercules and Perseus and Theseus, the heroes. The Greeks understood those stories to have happened long ago. And I can only imagine how long ago, 500 or 600 years must have seemed back then. Back when we don't have sort of historical records that we have that bring the past close to us. That was an ancient, unbelievably old time for them. But it still formed the basis of their culture, of their religion. But it wasn't the world they lived in anymore. And if I'm going to kind of walk you through some of the changes that happened between the Bronze Age, the Heroic Age, and the Classical Age, which is what I'm going to be talking about today. The first and biggest thing is that the Heroic Age was an age of aristocratic warrior chieftain kings. You know, Achilles, Menelaus, Agamemnon, these were all kings of their small little kingdom in Greece. And they were not democracies. We talk about, Athens being the cradle of democracy. Well, that was hundreds of years in the future. The Heroic Age was ruled by warlords and their bands of retainers, their fellow warriors, and they basically ruled with an iron fist. And they, a military-based society like that doesn't particularly grow and thrive the way Greece would under democracy. But things started changing after what they call the Greek Dark Ages. So if we're talking about the Trojan War being around 1200 BC, there's a period of about 200 or 300 years where we kind of lose everything that was building up in Greek society. They had written systems of language that kind of disappeared. They had technologies and architecture and artwork that kind of disappeared. It was a dark age, just like the medieval dark age would be 1,500 years later. And what emerged out of that was what we call the Archaic Era. And the Archaic Era, the big thing that we start seeing is that we don't know exactly why the Dark Age happened, but we know that these kingdoms, these warrior chieftains, they fell. Their kingdoms fell, and it might have been a combination of earthquakes, could have been disease, could have been foreign invaders, we don't really know. But what happened after 200 years of Dark Age is that the people who were left formed small communities that gradually grew bigger, and they weren't based on war. They weren't based on conquest. They were based on commerce. They were based on agriculture. They were based on communities. And those communities became known as the polis, the city-state. And these became what we all know today: Athens, Sparta, Thebes. There were like 1,000 of these small city-states throughout Greece in the Archaic Age. And as they grew, they started to rub elbows with their neighbors, as any expanding power does, and sometimes that erupted into warfare. And the way those wars were resolved was through the hoplite class. Now I'm going to get into all the equipment of the hoplite a little bit later, but first I wanted to explain to you who they were. All right, these were not professional soldiers. These were not even trained soldiers. These are citizens who had the means, who were rich enough to buy their own equipment. That basically bought you the honor of fighting in your city's combat line, what they would call the phalanx, which is basically a big scrum of men, maybe 8 ranks deep and as many wide as you had. A small city-state might only have 400 hoplites or something. A big city-state might have 4,000 or more. But these were tended to be small wars, 2 city-states next to each other, fighting over some scrap of probably not even very good farmland between them. Or maybe it could have been just an honor issue. I mean, the Trojan War itself is said to have started just because, someone's wife was stolen, right? And that led to 10 years of war. So the Greeks were willing to throw down and fight for not particularly good reasons, as we would define them, but it was important to their honor, their sense of excellence. And, the nature of the combat would generally be, remember, these are your neighbors. So the word goes out, pack 3 days rations. And the Greeks would, after a while, basically pack them enough food for the last 3 days. That's 1 day to march across the mountain pass to the neighboring city that you're having a war with, 1 day to fight, and then 1 day to get back. This is not a long war by today's standards, right? We fight wars that last years, battles last months. But in the Greek world, war was battle, and it was done quickly, and it was done decisively. This is the whole thing. This is a really interesting concept that doesn't apply in most of the world, especially back then. The idea of the decisive battle. We're not going to just sort of have a long guerrilla campaign. We're not going to snipe at each other and try to do damage and ambush each other. We're going to meet face to face with spears and shields and armor and decide the battle on that day. And that's exactly what they would do. They would form up. They would put all this stuff on. They would, of course, getting there, I should mention, they're not carrying all this stuff. These are gentlemen, after all. These are the rich guys. So they have their servants, usually their slaves, carrying the stuff for them. So up until the last moment of battle, they're just sort of hanging around. But okay, you're on the big flat battlefield, it's time to fight. And you put on all this equipment, and you face the enemy phalanx with your own, and then you smash into each other. And it's just a pushing and a stabbing and a screaming contest that I cannot imagine lasted more than a few minutes, because it's too exhausting. The stuff is too heavy, you're under the hot Greek sun. Sooner or later, one side gives, one side breaks. They get pushed off the battlefield, and the winner is the person left in control of the battlefield. The enemy comes back, requests the bodies of their dead. That's basically a formal admission of surrender. The victors, most of the time, grant them the bodies. It was very important to both sides to take care of your dead. And then they would erect a trophy. That's where our word comes from, trophy. It's literally from the Greek word to turn. You plant this thing right at the turning point of the battle where the enemy line had broken. You plant kind of a scarecrow, wood trunk with some enemy armor nailed to it. And that would be your trophy, your marker for your victory that day. And it's only a temporary trophy. You don't build something permanent, because these are your neighbors after all, right? You have to get along with them. You're gonna continue to survive, they continue to survive, but you won that day. You get that piece of common farmland, at least for that year. Maybe things will change next year. Maybe the alliances will shift. You'll get some allies to help you next year. But the point I want to make is that these are not wars of conquest. These are not wars of obliteration or domination. That's the way we kind of tend to fight wars today. If you defeat your enemy, you crush them, you occupy them, they become legal. And Greece was not like that. It was kind of a live and let live system. And it survived for an incredibly long time. That's one of the points I always like to make to people. It's just hundreds of years that this system survived. The Greek state celebrated warfare. As I said, it's the wealthy guys that got the privilege of fighting. They were all heroes. War was embraced, but it was limited. The culture of fighting limited war, so it didn't ravage, it didn't destroy, it didn't slaughter innocents so much. That happened later, and we'll get into that. Before I get into the details of the hoplite equipment, I brought some new stuff to show you, some things that I made in this last year. Because I want to tell a story not just of the rich hoplites, but of the poorer men too. And some of them did fight, whether as slaves or as servants or as mercenaries. There were a lot of light infantrymen that didn't have the means to buy the expensive bronze equipment. And I'd like to show some background. Costume change. That hat was funny. How about this one? So you didn't see this last year, right? This is new. Okay? This is the equipment of what we would call, the Greeks call Hoplites. When we talk about throwing something, he pelted him with a rock. Well, that's going back to the Greek for throw. So a peltist would throw javelins. The other name for these kind of soldiers were siloi, which literally translates to naked. We don't think they meant literally naked, although they might have. They probably meant naked of armor, naked of the bronze panoply that made a hoplite a real soldier. So these guys might literally have been throwing rocks. We probably know a lot of them were throwing rocks. Some of them might have had bows and arrows. A lot of them, if they were well equipped, would have had javelins like this. This is different from the thrusting spear that I'll be showing you later. These are things that you would throw. And because these guys weren't fighting the hoplites. as you can guess, this shield is made of wicker, right? It's made of sticks woven through rawhide, which is sort of a hard, untanned leather. It's good for, if someone throws a rock at you, it will probably stop the rock. It's certainly not going to stop a sword or a spear or something. But, the guys that are carrying these light shields, and maybe they did lucky to even have a shield, a lot of them didn't have shields, they would drape animal skins off their arms and sort of hold that in front of them to protect them from rocks and stuff. But these guys would have generally been on the sides of the battle, the sides of each of the main phalanxes filled with the hoplites in the center. That's where the battle would be decided. These guys were kind of just making sure that the battle was fought where it needed to be fought by who needed to settle it, the hoplites. But I just thought it was interesting to kind of see, in antiquity is so interesting. Ancient Greece is a world that is so technologically advanced in some ways, right? They're doing bronze work of a sort that it's hard to even find today. But those are the rich guys. The poor guys are almost living like cavemen. They're throwing rocks at each other and wearing animal skins. So it's this balance of the very primitive and the very sophisticated, the very cultured that I find very interesting. This hat that I'm wearing this is a fashion that came from the north. It's called a Scythian hat or a Thracian hat. And Scythia is basically up like where Ukraine and Russia and Bulgaria is today. And Thrace, that's still part of Greece, but it's northern Greece. And so this was a style that was actually seen by mainland southern Greece, the Athenians, the Spartans, as sort of barbaric. Often these guys would be wearing pants, which was considered highly barbaric. But it gets colder up there, and you want to have something on your legs in northern Greece and north of that. So these were sort of foreign fashions that were kind of adopted the same way that foreign styles and new styles and exotic styles have always been adopted by cultures. So anyway, just wanted to give you a little presentation on the Scythian peltis. And they wore these heavy garments too, which is it's a little bit different in style than the Greek ones. It's more like a full cloak, but it's the same idea. You'd sleep in this at night, and so the peltis. Get a sense of how it's made. Why go to the trouble of making a shield like that that's woven out of sticks, leather, not very strong? But why was this what they did? And the answer is because that's what they had. You think about like a goat herder in rural Greece. He doesn't have any money. He couldn't even go to a store and buy boards of wood because boards of wood don't exist yet. So that shield is something that a goat herder out in the country could literally put together himself as he sat there all day watching his goat herds. Get some sticks, maybe a hide from one of his goats, and he can spend the time, the many hours that it takes to make something like that. It'll give them some protection in combat if you ever face it. Okay, now we're going to get to the good stuff here. When we talk about hoplites, we are talking definitely about a man of means. This bronze armor is incredibly expensive to make. It would have been back then fantastically expensive. It's what marked you as a pillar of your community. It's what you would spend your disposable income on. You didn't have the usual luxuries that rich guys would spend their money on today. So you put your money into your armor. Bronze is the metal that this is all made of, which is an alloy of brass and tin. I'm sorry, an alloy of copper and tin. Brass is an alloy of copper and zinc. It's slightly different. It's got a little bit more of a yellowish color. And it hadn't been invented yet. The Romans are going to be the ones to figure out brass a bit later. But one of the great things about bronze, aside from the fact that it looks beautiful, is that it survives. You bury brass in the ground, as the Greeks did. A lot of stuff is dug up at sanctuaries. Delphi and Olympia, if you go to dedicate armor, sometimes your own, more often the armor of a defeated enemy after a battle, you dedicate it to the gods, because these guys took that stuff seriously. And you see, the temples, if you went to Delphi as a pilgrim, the temples, the sanctuaries, each city-state would have had their own structure. And a lot of them still survive. And they would have been just filled, hung with all the armor that city's hoplites had won in battle, had taken from the enemy in battle. And over hundreds of years, these sanctuaries, these temples just got too crowded, and they had to get rid of this stuff somehow. And they couldn't resell it. It's been dedicated to the gods. It belongs to the gods. You can't destroy it. You have to keep it within the confines of the sanctuary. So what they did is they buried it. They buried it in deep pits and wells. And what that's allowed us to do is get a very good archaeological sense of when different styles of lumber came from. Because we found them this deep or that deep or that deep in these wells. So that's one of the interesting things about archaeology that comes into play. So that's what happened with iron armor. The Romans later were wearing iron armor. Everyone, once iron becomes an accessible technology, is wearing iron armor. It's cheaper. To get the tin to make bronze, you're having to import it probably from Afghanistan. That's where the Greeks are getting their tin. Now, that's a long ways today. You can imagine how long it was then. Even the copper has to be imported from Cyprus. But iron is a much more common mineral. That's found almost anywhere. Once you figure out how to get it out of the ground, that's a lot cheaper. It's a lot stronger. It's lighter weight. Everyone uses it. The problem is it doesn't survive. If you put iron in the ground, it rusts away. And that's why we have so little. We have more Greek armor than we do medieval armor. Because even in the medieval era, the iron didn't last. It tended to be years. So, working our way from the bottom up, the Greeks had a great love of the human body, the human form. They're renowned for it. The sculpture celebrates it, and the armor celebrates it as well. This armor is designed to be as sleek and as minimal and as anatomical as possible. They don't want it to look like armor. They want the person who's wearing it to look like they're made of bronze. And that's actually one of the things that they were known as back in the day. The Egyptians called the Greeks the men of bronze for this reason. And I love the simplicity of these designs. There's no buckles, there's no straps. It has to be made to fit one person's body. I actually made casts of my legs and sent them to Poland, where there was some artisan there who was able to make these for me. So they only fit me, and they're kind of excruciating to put on. So you just sort of clamp it around your shin. And they're basically held on just by their own tension on the leg that's perfectly formed to fit. So those are the degrees. I'm going to ask Mr. Kosakas to come up here and help me with my cuirass here. Last time I was here, I was wearing this one, right? So this is a composite cuirass that's made out of linen and leather. Again, we know exactly what these look like because it's all around the pottery, but we don't know, there are no surviving examples of it because linen and leather, unlike bronze, doesn't last. We don't even really know if they were linen and leather, or linen or leather, or one or the other. But we know exactly what they look like. And so this is my sort of guess at what they were made like. And it weighs about the same thing as the bronze armor. But having done some tests with spears, it's nowhere near as good as stopping spears. So this is definitely the more economical version. So I brought this last time, but it wasn't done yet. I just wanted to kind of show you what it was. But it's now done. And so I'm going to go ahead and put it on. So we'll just take a minute or two. But remember, I said all the Greek hoplites had their servants or slaves. This is one of the reasons that you needed one, because it's impossible to get into this stuff on your own. If anyone has any questions while I'm doing this, go ahead and shout it out, and I'll answer. surprised to know that battles were often decided because one side surprised the other, right? This is not something you can just go to grab. It takes a while to put it on, and but once it's on, what's fun? It's actually quite comfortable. This weighs about 12 pounds, you know, It's solid bronze, front and back, about a little over 1 millimeter thick, which doesn't seem like it's very thick, but it is enough to stop a pretty strong spear thrust. So if you had this on, you're doing pretty good. Obviously, it doesn't protect the whole body, but it protects the most vital organs. A lot of hoplites didn't have either type of armor. They just relied on a shield, which, as you can see here, the shield does do a pretty good job of protecting it entirely. The shield is made of wood. It weighs many times more than that little wicker thing I passed around. Even still, though, this will not stop a determined spear thrust. One of the first things I did after I got it was test it out with a spear, and the spear actually went pretty easily through it. But the interesting thing was that it could not get the spear out afterwards. So that's an interesting bit of history that historians are interested in. That it's not actually a good way to fight a battle with spear and shield by sticking the enemy's shield, because you just lost your spear. The shield is made of wood. Several layers of thin slats that are sort of formed and steam bent and then kind of held together with an outer covering of linen. Maybe if you were very wealthy, you could have gotten full bronze facing, or just a bronze edge like this one has. But you can see on the inside that it's basically just a big wooden salad bowl. And they're very hard to make. They're very expensive to buy if you have to buy one. Because this is just not a very natural shape. And we always wonder, why did they even have a shape like this? Other cultures have round shields, they have rectangular shields, they have all sorts of, what is it about the Greek shield that requires this very difficult to make bowl shape? And the answer, we think, has to do with the type of fighting that the Greek conflict did. When you're in battle, when you're in phalanx, you don't know exactly how close you packed they started. Most people think that you had probably about the width of a shield. That was probably the measure of the line. So if you had 100 hoplites in line in a phalanx, it would be 100 meters. But once you actually are involved in battle, you tend to crush in, to push in. And when you have 8 ranks behind you, later 25 ranks, ultimately it was a famous battle where the Thebans defeated the Spartans with the formation 50 hoplites deep. You can imagine 50 guys pushing from behind. Think of it like a reverse tug of war. You're facing the enemy, shield to shield, and you've got 50 guys pushing you, and he's got all his guys pushing you in. So what this shield allows is, it allows you to breathe, right? Because it bridges the chest to the thigh, and it gives you this concavity that allows your diaphragm to breathe. Otherwise, you would have been crushed. People get crushed all the time. There's a fire in the theater. That's how people die. They don't get burned to death. They get crushed to get to death. They get asphyxiated because bodies are crushed so hard that they're unable to breathe. So that's one of the reasons why we think this shield is designed to do this. It also is quite comfortable. You can rest it on the shoulder, and that's a pretty good way to carry it for an extended time. It also, I think, has a psychological benefit, because even though it's just, at the end of the day, a pretty thin wood, it has a psychological benefit. You really can kind of get inside it. And I think these guys really must have needed that extra assurance when they went into battle. Because remember, these are not trained soldiers. These are not hardened soldiers. Most Greek city-states took great pride in the fact that they weren't trained soldiers. Athenians famously looked down on Spartans. The Spartans are spending all their time practicing for battle, practicing for war. And here I need to sort of step outside of the narrative that I've been telling about the city-states and the amateur soldiers to talk to us a little bit about Sparta. Sparta is not my main area of interest, but we have other guys in our group that are all about Sparta. And what they find very interesting is that this was, unlike the other city-states, this was a real military culture. The Spartans were basically the landowning elite who trained for battle year-round. Other Greeks didn't train, Spartans did. That made them right there much better soldiers. very feared soldiers. But what were the other Greeks doing for the rest of the year? They were mostly farmers, they were tradesmen, they worked for a living. Spartans didn't have to work because they had enslaved their fellow Greeks. Now, I mentioned before that most of these guys had slaves anyhow, and that's true. But mostly slaves were foreigners, they were defeated enemies in battle. They were not entire subjugated Greek populations. And Sparta had done that to the Messenians, who lived kind of to the west of where Sparta is in the Peloponnese Peninsula. And so the rest of Greece kind of looked askance at that. Like, those are other Greek people. You know, we talked about how they didn't wipe out city-states even after battle. Well, the Spartans basically did kind of wipe out those city-states, and they kept those people subjugated in what they called the Hoplites. And they had to spend a significant portion of their time just policing their subjugated slave population, who vastly outnumbered the Spartans themselves. So anyway, the Spartans were great soldiers, and they formed the vanguard of the soldiers that stopped the Persians when they invaded Greece around the beginning of the 5th century. When we talk about the classical era, by the way, that's the time we're talking about. We're talking about the time around the time at the beginning of the 5th century BC, when the Persian Empire invaded Greece. Greece had always sort of been tolerated as this little backwater on the edge of a vastly wealthier and vastly more civilized Persian Empire. But some of the Greek states had done a few things to incite the ire and wrath of the Persians. And so they sent an army to take care of Greece. And everyone thought it was going to be an easy walkover. And instead, the Persians ended up losing twice. Pretty bad too. And after the second of those defeats, which involved the Battle of Thermopylae, anyone seen the movie 300? Well, you know, that's a very, very fictionalized version of a very real battle. It was a great defeat, but it was an inspirational great defeat. The Spartans died to the last man, almost. And they inspired the rest of Greece to stand up and defeat the Persians the next year. So basically, in the wake of those Persian invasions, you have this flowering of Greece. Greece is all of a sudden, they've proven themselves, they're a world power in that small world of the Mediterranean. Athens in particular becomes very prosperous and establishes all these colonies, which eventually end up turning into an empire. But this is the golden age of Greek drama, this is the golden age of Greek philosophy. Sophocles, Euripides, Socrates, the philosopher, was famously a very brave hoplite, you know, because, like, again, anyone who was anyone in a Greek polis would take their place in the battle line. So I never got around to finishing my equipment here. This helmet is, there are many types of helmets that the Greeks wore, but this is what's called a Corinthian helmet. Probably devised in Corinth, but pretty widely universally worn by Greek hoplites for many years. And its appeal is pretty obvious. You know, when you put it on, it doesn't expose a lot of your face. You can't see very well, you can't hear very well, but it does protect you pretty well. And the helmet liner, by the way, is made of woven grass. And again, this is kind of speculative. Woven grass helmet liner, or whatever it was, doesn't survive in the ground for 2,500 years. But there was a shipwreck found off the coast of Italy that had some old helmets in them. And incredibly, these woven grass headband or helmet liners had survived in the mud, away from any oxygen and bacteria. And so it's a pretty good guess that that's what they would have kind of used as a shock absorbing helmet liner. So often, first off, you see the helmet worn like this. If you've ever seen a statue of Pericles giving his famous orations at the Acropolis, he's wearing his helmet back like this. For obvious reasons, you can read. You can see, I wouldn't call it comfortable, but it looks pretty cool. And that was very important to the Greeks. In battle, of course, you lower it. Here, This is not a javelin. This is not a throwing spear. If you look at it really closely, you can see that it tapers from the point to the back. It's much thicker back here than it is up here. Anyone have any ideas about why that might be? Anyone? Balance? What was the question? Why does this spear taper? Why is it narrower at the point than in back? Go ahead.
Go faster?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't penetrate any better. The reason is that the balance point shifts back. So because I'm holding it back here, I've got more reach, right? And that's what I want. I want to be able to reach out and hit as many of those guys I'm facing, while at the same time not spearing the guys behind me. And of course, this butt spike kind of makes that a bit difficult. You wonder why they would have put something on there like that. One very practical reason is that you can just stick it into the ground, and you don't have to constantly be picking up your spear from the ground. And that's probably a reason not to have a butt spike. But it does make it very important when you're actually fighting in phalanx. That you keep that point back, right? Because if you fight like this, that's not so great for the guy behind you. And if you do, there are Greek bases that show exactly that. That show a guy fighting his enemy in front and spearing his companion behind him. That's a real danger, especially as Greek actors. So when we actually do our mock battles, we actually make kind of padded versions of this that are like kind of Q-tip, like pugil sticks. But with a rear-weighted spear, you have that range. You're able to reach in front of maybe the guy in front of you and maybe even two guys in front of you, especially when you're all packed together. But that's pretty much what battle is. Stabby, stabby, jabby, jabby, jabby. There's not a lot of subtlety to it. Not a lot of subtlety to it, but it's interesting. It's as savage as it is. It's well suited. It's well suited to an amateur army that doesn't have any training, because when you're packed together with your fellow citizens, and remember, like this is your whole community. These are not just like the soldiers or the young guys or even just the rich guys. This is everyone fighting in these battles. As a hoplite, you might be fighting. The age of call-up could go from 18 to 60. So you could literally be fighting in the phalanx next to your brother, your father, your son. And in a context like that, even if you could run away, you're not going to, right? And the Greeks knew this. And they leveraged that to give their armies a cohesion that it otherwise wouldn't have had. When you're fighting for your community, with your community, it's a very different thing from when you're a soldier who's sent to fight some foreign war someplace. And I think there's really a lot to admire about the whole Greek model of warfare. As warlike as it was, as much as it romanticized violence, like I said, it restricted that violence, and it meant that the burden of warfare, the bloodshed, the suffering, was borne not even just equally among people, but especially on the wealthy, the ones who could afford to do this in the first place, to have the privilege of fighting. And I kind of think that's how it should continue to be fought. Put the rich guys in front, the ones who are standing to gain from whatever gets accomplished in the war. Let them fight it. So we have about 15 minutes left. I wanted to kind of open it up to any questions that people had. I know I kind of covered a lot of ground and not necessarily in a very organized fashion, but if you had any comments or questions about anything, now's the time. Yes? Sorry? Come on up. He was the first to ask.
I do it next.
Now, badly.
How about if you guys want to hang out afterwards for a minute, you can kind of see this stuff and try it on. But any questions right now for the larger group? Yes. We're not trying anything out right now.
Questions first, then try.
Why wear such a tall hat?
Because that was the fashion. I think that having that tall peak is kind of like having the tall crest on the helmet. You know, it's not really practical. Actually, it makes it a lot harder to fight. But you know, so much of what you're doing is when you get pitted out and stuff like this is you're trying to look terrifying. You're trying to freak out the other side because they're facing you, right? They're looking at this vast army of guys identically equipped to you. Everyone's got the same spear, shield, helmet, and you know you got to unnerve them somehow. Psychological warfare was a big thing right from the start.
So like the whole point, like a lot of kids are really to like balance this mental shit. Like why just put a hat and then just put like whatever the hat is on top. You know what I mean? It's like I get intimidation. I wouldn't be scared if I saw a guy with blowing hair.
Well,
I would be scared more.
I think it was pretty intimidating.
I think the spear looks pretty intimidating.
Yeah. Well, I should mention, you know, that like the end of the hoplite era, the end of classical Greece comes largely with the change of military tactics and equipment. You know, after centuries of city-states fighting each other, you have Macedonia up in the north of Greece, which is not even really considered part of Greece back then. Okay.
Look at
Come out and actually do this. Now we do events. We do events all over the world. And we also do
So, are there any other questions from this side of the room, maybe? No? Yes? What's that? Oh, the shape. Oh, this is the. Again, this is speculative. Like, no historian can tell you this. There's no record that says this is why shields are shaped this way. But it's one of the things that, again, reenactors are figuring out. And again, this is just my theory. It's not necessarily true. But what I've found, having constructed one of these, is that, you know, if you hold out your arm the way you naturally would when you're throwing a javelin. If you imagine I'm not holding a shield at all. You're kind of doing something like this, like you have your arm off the balance. And I think that this cutout is just to give you a little bit more clearance when you're throwing the javelin. I think that's as good a theory as any. Yes?
I think that the shape of the shield, you should put the javelin on top when you charge it.
Yes, and it doesn't really work though. I mean, sometimes there are shields that have cutouts like that, but you get in trouble every time if you actually try to hold it. But you're not playing a fool, you know? A lot of people have done that. And maybe that's right. It's not that big. Any other questions?
How many do they carry?
How many javelins? How many javelins? Oh, that's a good question. We usually, you know, they carry as many as they can hold in one hand. Because you're holding them in your left hand and throwing them in the other. They don't seem to use a quiver. You know, I think they just kind of held them. These are actually on the short side for what throwing a javelin would have been. So you can't really keep something like that in a quiver anymore. Again, I don't, you know, obviously, even if you have like, you know, if you
can carry maybe 6, that's a lot. It doesn't last very long if you're chucking spears very long, but I think it's just, again, it's that potential force. Right? As long as you're holding the flank of the hoplite phalanx and you're threatening with the weapon, you're keeping the other side at bay, you're serving your purpose. Yes. Sorry?
Quiet down. Somebody asked a question.
Oh, they had bows and arrows too. A javelin is just a lot more powerful. Like it's a shorter range weapon, but it's going to land with more power than the types of kind of light bows and arrows that the Greeks were using. Later on, my bows got much more powerful. Like in the Middle Ages, the English longbow, that's a very powerful weapon. But they didn't have that. Anyone else? Yes?
What inspired you to get into this?
I'm sorry?
What was the inspiration to start this?
My inspiration to do
Yeah,
this?
and reason in particular.
Well, I mean, like I said, I've been into this stuff since I was a little kid, you know, and at some point, you know, when I was a kid, I'd paint little figurines of them, and, you know, you get older, you get a little disposable income, and you don't want to beat a little, you want to paint a little guy, you want to beat a little guy, right? And so that's what reenacting is. And what I really enjoy doing with the Greek stuff is, you know, if you're reenacting most other eras, you're buying their stuff, right? You're buying your equipment from someone who's made it in the factory. But with the Greek stuff, you can't buy it. You can't buy the good stuff there. You can buy like cheap copies, but if you really want to get it right, you gotta make it yourself. And it's gotta fit you. So like, I made this stuff myself. I made this out of bronze myself. I wove the grass from my helmet. I painted everything. You know, I made the shields. And that's a very interesting part of the hobby too, because it really connects you with it. You know, you're learning ancient crafts on top of ancient history. All right, anyone else? Yes.
Did they use horses?
That's a great question. They did use horses. Your very wealthiest guys might serve in the cavalry, even though that was sort of had less status. You know, cavalry, obviously it cost money to maintain a horse, so that was just for rich, but a real man would fight in the Philippines. And so a lot of them would leave their horses behind to fight on foot. The main reason that the Greeks did use cavalry so much, at least down in the south, where most of the city-states were, is that Greece is very mountainous. You know, it's not good horse country. Up north in Thessaly and Macedon and Thrace, it's much wider over and you have a lot of horse cultures. But down south, it's just not good horse country. It's not good for raising them. It's not good for using them in battle. But eventually they would really be embraced. And the Macedonians under Alexander the Great would use cavalry as their main fighting weapon, and that was what defeat the Persian Empire. But that's kind of after this era. So they did have cavalry, but they were mostly like, you know, it basically would be a guy with maybe one of these and maybe one of these, and no armor and a hat. So it's not heavy cavalry, you know, it's not the kind of thing crash into an enemy.